Hi everyone, my name is Alexander Zalivako, and I'm the founder of From A to Z law firm. One of the areas of our expertise are sanctions, and in a series of presentations called Sanctions 360 Degrees, we will look into major sanctions economic regimes and the way they affect the lives of private individuals and corporations. Thank you very much for watching. I would like to make today a short update on the developments in the EU and very similar UK sanctions with respect to Iran, following the snapback activated by Germany, France, and UK at the UN level, and briefly discuss the following points: the legal effect of the snapback, and then the reintroduction of the European sanctions with respect to Iran, and more specifically focusing on the energy sector, finance sector, precious and non-precious metal sector, and then shipping and transport as the key areas affected by the reintroduction of sanctions. In essence, the reason for this update is that with these new measures becoming effective on the 30th of September, the landscape legally in terms of the sanctions which are relevant for the trade between EU persons or UK persons and Iran changes fundamentally. And this is of relevance, of immediate relevance for all EU persons dealing with Iran, or for the Iranian nationals or companies dealing with European Union or the UK. We briefly discussed the background to the Iranian sanctions, the historical events leading to them, and the major principles in our earlier presentation. And the purpose is not to repeat those points here, but just to give an update. Bottom line is that following the trigger of the snapback mechanism by European countries, end of August, in their assessment, the snapback mechanism became effective, and following that, national sanctions were reintroduced. There is a broader dispute as to whether the UN snapback mechanism was effectively utilized, and we discussed that in our earlier video. Whatever the answer to this dispute in practical terms, as the regulations within the European Union and the relevant amendments to the UK sanctions regulations have been adopted, as far as European or UK legal environment is concerned, this is largely of academic relevance because the EU persons have to comply with the relevant regulations, reintroducing sanctions against Iran, which were passed in the EU on the 29th of September. There were 3 acts: the regulation amending the existing regulation 267, which is the main regulation dealing with the non-proliferation program of Iran. So that regulation was amended, and those amendments we discussed today. And then there were 2 implementing regulations, which largely released various Iranian persons or entities to the blocking sanctions. We would now consider the changes introduced to the energy sector of Iran, and these are substantial. First of all major players of the Iranian oil and gas sector were redesignated as blocked persons in the European Union, which means that their assets and the assets of those persons which are owned or controlled by them have to be blocked. I list here some of the main players in the Iranian sector, and it's clear that the effect of this designation is substantial. In addition to these designations, the transactions related to export, import, and ancillary services with Iranian crude and petroleum products, as well as petrochemical products, is prohibited. But this is largely corollary of the blocking sanctions being introduced against major Iranian players, which are by far more comprehensive and certainly include dealing with the relevant commodities which they produce. In addition to this, it's prohibited to export to Iran equipment used in the exploration or refining or liquefaction of oil or natural gas, as well as the equipment relevant for the petrochemical industry. The specific items of the equipment are listed in the annexes to the snapback regulation. And again, given that the major players in these industries have been designated in their own name to blocking sanctions, these sanctions are largely complementary and legal in terms of practical restrictions. Importantly, there is a grandfathering period for the completion of existing contracts. It is not clear at this moment how this grandfathering period for the completion of existing contract will coexist with the blocking of the persons which may be subject to the contracts. The default position is that it's not sufficient, but that is the matter which has to be considered on a case-by-case basis. And in certain circumstances, an authorization may need to be sought from the relevant national competent authorities. Another major block of reintroduced sanctions relate to the financial sector of Iran. And here again, the main block relates to the designation as blocked persons at the Central Bank of Iran and multiple major financial institutions in Iran. Again, the effect of this is that, in essence, any type of interaction with those persons would be subject to restrictions, and the assets of those persons, to the extent they're present in the European Union, will need to be blocked. It is now prohibited for European banks to open corresponding accounts on new establishments, whether in the forms of subsidiaries, branches, or representatives office in Iran, and the corollary prohibition for the Iranian banks to do in the European Union, again, given that the list of blocked persons now includes the central bank and almost any large Iranian bank, this type of additional restrictions seems to be of additional ancillary nature. A separate point relates to the restrictions with respect to the insurance sector, where European insurance and reinsurance companies, in essence, are prohibited from providing these services to the Iranian persons, subject to closed list of exemptions, which relate to providing life and health insurance, as well as third liability insurance to natural persons, third liability insurance to diplomatic missions, as well as legal persons within the European Union, and certain limited vessels and aircraft insurance exemptions. There are important restrictions on the transfer of funds between EU institutions and Iranian institutions, where, in essence, any transfer in excess of 10,000 euros requires a prior authorization. There are higher thresholds for personal remittances and agricultural and healthcare goods of 40,000 euros and 100,000 euros or its equivalent in other currencies. Again, this is a separate prohibition which works in addition to blocking of major Iranian institutions, which means that even very little transfers to them is subject to EU blocking sanctions and prohibited unless there are certain exemptions. Importantly, there are restrictions which go beyond interacting with the Iranian banks and financial institutions, but which relate to any Iranian person, entity, and body. This is a defined term, which does not include Iranian nationals living in the European Union, for example, which is important because certainly there are many Iranian nationals living outside of their country, and it would be discriminatory if these measures would affect their capacity to make transfers unrelated to Iran, but to their daily life in the European Union. Nevertheless, the restriction is broad and related to any individual living in Iran, regardless of her or his nationality, as well as Iranian companies or their subsidiaries anywhere in the world. In essence, the rule is here that the restrictions, very similar to those which we mentioned with respect to the financial institutions, apply with slightly different thresholds, namely any transfers equal to exceeding 40,000 euros rather than 10 would require an authorization, and a transfer exceeding the threshold of 10,000 euros is subject to a prior identification. This restriction is pretty comprehensive in its nature, applies to transfers even within the European Union from one banking institution to another, or even to the transfers when an EU banking institution acts as a correspondent bank, although in a slightly reduced way where the bank has to act on a best effort basis. Substantial restrictions are reintroduced with respect to the precious, non-precious sectors of the Iranian economy, as well as trade in diamonds. With respect to the precious, non-precious, and diamond sector, restrictions apply with respect to trade with the government of Iran or any entity or body controlled by it, but not with the private sector. The restriction with respect to the metals, non-precious metals, is broader and would generally apply to any transactions where Iranian person is a counterparty, or whether the relevant metal may be used in Iran, which means that by interposing an intermediary, the relevant transaction would still be caught by this prohibition. The ultimate end use relates to Iran. Final important sector which we would consider is shipping and transport sector, where the relevant designations to the blocking sanctions have been made to major Iranian shipping companies and their subsidiaries, as well as entities controlled by it, as well as the prohibitions were reintroduced relating to the export of the equipment used in shipbuilding, maintenance of refit, together with the restrictions to provide shipping services to the Iranian persons who may wish to transport oil or petrochemical products, or to any persons dealing with Iranian oil and petrochemical products. In summary, these are very important legal restrictions which fundamentally change the legal landscape. It may be that due to the US sanctions which have been reintroduced back in 2018 when the US unilaterally withdrew from Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, many of them would be of little practical relevance for day-to-day business with Iran, which has been substantially reduced since 2018 due to the US secondary sanctions. And nevertheless, there are some important restrictions, specifically in the financial sector, which are obviously of relevance for EU banking institutions and need to be incorporated in their day-to-day policies and operational guidelines. Thank you very much for watching. I trust that you found this presentation useful and hope to see you during my next presentations.